So have you ever tried to just completely stop your thoughts? Like you're lying in bed, right? You're
Oh,
staring at the ceiling, you desperately need to sleep, and you give your brain one incredibly clear directive, which is just shut down.
right. And we all know exactly how well that works out.
Yeah, doesn't at all. Instead, your mind immediately generates like 10 completely new, totally fabricated scenarios for you to worry about.
Oh, absolutely. It's like suddenly you're analyzing a weird conversation you had, I don't know, 5 years ago.
Yes. Or you're planning this hypothetical argument with your boss that is probably never, ever going to happen. And it's exhausting. It's this relentless cognitive load. And if you're listening right now and you recognize that exact feeling, well, you are exactly who we are doing this deep dive for today.
Yeah, because it really is the universal baseline of the human condition. We're
Yeah.
all dealing with this internal apparatus that just feels, quite frankly, entirely out of our control most of the time.
It really does.
Eh.
And the source we have for today's deep dive is fascinating because it tackles this head on. It's this ancient, highly technical manual for the human mind. And it makes this incredibly confronting claim right from the jump, which is that 99% of what you consider to be thinking isn't actually thinking at all.
Right.
He calls it an involuntary hallucination, like a simulation your brain is running that you never actually authorized.
Which is such a wild concept to wrap your head around, because what's fascinating here is that the framework we're exploring today, it doesn't approach this problem with vague philosophical poetry. It approaches the mind as a literal machine.
Yeah, it's very mechanical.
Exactly. It's a mechanical breakdown of how human consciousness operates. It dissects the exact gears and levers that create our internal reality. And the core promise of this whole architecture is radical. It claims that mastering this internal machinery is the ultimate purpose of human life.
So that's our mission for today. We are going to unpack these exact mechanics. We want to map out why our neurological architecture causes us so much unnecessary stress. And we're going to trace a literal roadmap to a state that this framework describes as experiencing exactly 0% suffering.
Not just, a slight reduction in stress.
Right, not like 10% happier, absolute zero.
Yeah, zero. But, before we can fix the anxiety happening inside our heads, we have to correctly identify what's actually operating in there.
So true.
And the starting point for that is a massive reality check. The foundational premise of this entire text is this: you are not your thoughts.
Okay, let's unpack this, because that's one of those phrases that sounds great on a bumper sticker, but mechanically, what does that actually mean?
Well, the distinction the architecture makes here is incredibly precise. It categorizes the mind, like the core foundational consciousness, as something entirely separate from your thoughts. Thoughts are classified merely as the conscious chatter, the surface level activity. Beneath that, you have your habits and your knee-jerk reactions, which operate from the subconscious. But the true original mind lies even deeper than both of those things.
It kind of reminds me of looking at a computer's operating system.
Right.
Like the original mind is the foundational OS. It's just the blank, capable environment.
Oh, that's a great way to put it.
And your subconscious habits, those are the background processes running silently, eating up memory.
Yeah.
And your active thoughts, those are just the pop-up windows.
Yes. The pop-up window.
But the problem is we spend our entire lives identifying entirely with the pop-up windows. Like we assume that just because a window abruptly appeared on our screen demanding our attention, that it is the computer. We totally forget about the underlying operating system.
That is a highly functional way to visualize it. And the framework takes that distinction a step further by revealing a rather harsh truth about those pop-ups. It argues that what we so proudly label as thinking is actually a process called mental concoction.
Mental concoction.
Right. In the original source language, this concept is essentially described as a restless, involuntary fabrication. It's just useless anxiety that bubbles up when our underlying operating system is left unguarded.
Okay, wait. I have to push back on that categorization a little bit.
Yeah.
Because labeling it useless anxiety feels, I don't know, a bit broad.
How so?
Well, if I am, for example, stressing over a major work presentation I have to give tomorrow morning, I am running through potential questions the clients might ask. I'm mentally tweaking my slides in my head. I'm anticipating failure points. That feels to me like active, necessary problem solving.
Yeah.
How is that classified as a mental concoction and not, real productive cognitive function?
That friction point right there, that is exactly where the framework separates the masters from the
Oh,
amateurs.
wow. Okay.
Yeah, if we look at the strict criteria laid out for true thinking, the difference becomes really clear. The methodology asserts that genuine thinking does not cause psychological harm and it does not generate suffering.
Wait, really? Not at all.
None. True thinking only occurs when you apply concentrated, deliberate focus to the exact present moment, completely free from the gravitational pull of the past or the future.
So because my presentation is tomorrow.
Because your presentation is tomorrow, your anxiety is entirely future-oriented. You are fabricating scenarios that do not currently exist in reality.
Ah.
You're experiencing the physiological stress of an event that is entirely fictional right now, that is mental concoction. You're taking a neutral base reality, the fact that a presentation is scheduled, and you are actively cooking up a stressful, multi-layered hallucination of what if.
That hits hard.
Right. True thinking, according to this strict definition, would be the calm, focused action of sitting at your desk right now, physically arranging the slides. The precise moment your mind drifts away from the screen in front of you to wonder, what if the client hates this slide? You have abandoned true thinking and entered concoction.
That is a deeply uncomfortable reality to face. I mean, if I'm hearing this right, this framework is essentially classifying the vast majority of our daily cognitive function as an involuntary hallucination,
Pretty much, yeah.
which really explains why chronic exhaustion is such a modern epidemic. Like, we are burning massive amounts of cognitive energy running simulations of fictional pasts and futures all day long.
Exactly. We are constantly processing data that isn't actually there. And the methodology urges you to evaluate your own daily mental chatter through this specific lens. Like, track how much of your day is actually spent in true present moment cognitive function versus how much is just your mind churning out concoctions.
For the overwhelming majority of people, I guess the ratio is heavily, heavily skewed toward concoction.
Oh, unquestionably.
Which
Logically raises the next big problem.
Right, the toxic positivity problem. Because if most of our thinking is this harmful, exhausting wandering, why doesn't positive thinking work? I mean, the entire modern self-help industry is built on the premise of flipping the script.
Yep. Affirmations, good vibes, manifesting.
Exactly. If you're having a negative concoction, you're supposed to just force a positive concoction. But this framework argues that attempting to force positive thinking is actually a mechanical failure.
It completely dismantles the idea of forced positivity. And it does this by looking at the sheer scale of the momentum you're fighting.
What do you mean by momentum?
So the framework explains that our deeply ingrained thought patterns, our habits, they're not just the product of this current life's isolated experiences. It suggests these tendencies are accumulated over an unfathomably long timeline, multiple lifetimes, according to the original context.
Wow, okay.
And whether you interpret that literally or you view it through the lens of deep ancestral evolutionary conditioning that's just encoded into our nervous systems, the mechanical reality is identical. The momentum of your habits is ancient, massive, and incredibly dense.
So trying to stop it with an affirmation is like trying to stop a freight train with a sticky note.
That is the perfect analogy. Because of this massive accumulation of conditioning, attempting to perpetually force good thoughts is a statistical impossibility. The mind's mechanical nature is to operate like a pendulum.
Right.
It constantly swings between good concoctions and bad concoctions. If you expend all your energy pushing that pendulum hard into the positive side, well, gravity and momentum dictate that it will inevitably swing back into the negative side with equal force.
Which means relying on the content of your thoughts to bring you peace is a totally losing strategy, because the content will always fluctuate.
Precisely. The content is always changing. And this is where the methodology introduces what we might consider the ultimate hack for human consciousness. It offers a completely different paradigm. Instead of trying to control the thoughts, the alternative is to simply see the thoughts.
The mechanism of seeing versus controlling. Here's where it gets really interesting, going back to our computer analogy. It's like the difference between running a piece of malicious code on your main operating system versus running it in a secure, isolated sandbox environment.
Oh, I like that. Expand on that a bit.
Well, when you just default to automatic thinking, you fuse with the thought. The malicious code runs system-wide. Your heart rate spikes, your palms sweat, your mood crashes. You literally become the anxiety.
Right.
But when you see the thought, you're taking that exact same line of code and observing it in a sandbox. The thought still exists. The anxiety is still trying to execute. But because there's a gap between the operating system and the sandbox, it can't infect you. You've stepped outside of it.
That distinction between control and observation is the absolute crux of the entire methodology. The moment you observe a thought arising, rather than just blindly experiencing it, you create a critical layer of distance. You establish the observer and the observed as two entirely separate entities.
And this leads to what I think is the most structural, profound claim in the entire framework.
Right.
It states unequivocally that all suffering, every ounce of mental anguish, stress, and sorrow you experience stems exclusively from mental concoctions, all of it. By realizing that these pop-up windows are not you, you cease attaching your identity to them. And severing that attachment provides a permanent mechanical solution to mental suffering.
We really need to pause and analyze the weight of that claim. The methodology asserts that this process leads to a state where suffering is reduced to exactly 0%.
It's a huge claim.
It is, not a marginal improvement in daily stress management, 0%. And it stresses that this is not some abstract, poetic ideal. It is an achievable mechanical reality based purely on cause and effect.
And the logic underlying that 0% claim is kind of airtight if you follow the mechanics.
Yeah.
If the experience of suffering absolutely requires a person to attach themselves to a concocted thought, and you completely sever that attachment by continuously observing the thought as an external object in a sandbox.
Then the suffering loses its fuel source.
Exactly. The fire just suffocates.
Right. The root of all psychological suffering is identical across every single human experience. It is the mind's relentless tendency to concoct a simulated reality and then fiercely attach to it as if it were the absolute inescapable truth. When you train yourself to just see the thought, you starve that root system of oxygen entirely.
Okay, so if this structural loophole exists, if escaping the machinery of suffering is technically possible for every single human being, what are the prerequisites? Because we often assume that to achieve a state of profound mental clarity, you must possess immense intellectual capacity or maybe the financial freedom to retreat from society and meditate in silence for 6 months.
And that's a very common misconception. The architecture we are looking at operates as a great equalizer. It makes it explicitly clear that the baseline reality of the human machine is identical for everyone. Regardless of socioeconomic status, wealth, or the prestige of your formal education, every human consciousness defaults to the exact same mix of joy and suffering. True inner stability does not correlate with who you are on paper. It correlates entirely with how effectively you can track and manage your own internal cognitive processes.
So a billionaire can experience paralyzing, suffocating anxiety, and someone with absolutely no formal education can experience profound, unbroken tranquility.
Exactly. The framework makes a crucial distinction here between raw intelligence and actual mental mastery. Being highly intelligent, like being analytical, articulate, able to hold complex concepts in your mind, does not mean you are a master of your internal state. In fact, highly intelligent people often experience more intense suffering precisely because their capacity for mental concoction is so vast.
Oh, wow. So they basically possess a higher processing power, which they inadvertently use to render incredibly high-definition, complex labyrinths of anxiety.
That's exactly it. They can strategize a business acquisition 10 steps ahead, but they are completely powerless to stop their brain from ruthlessly replaying an embarrassing social interaction from a decade ago.
Feel very seen right now.
Right. We all do. The framework argues that raw intelligence is not the ultimate goal. Mastery is the goal. Mastery means utilizing thought purely as a tool at the exact appropriate time, rather than living as a subordinate who is constantly dragged around by whatever random, unverified data pops into consciousness.
Okay, so what does this all mean for you, listening right now? We often equate being smart with having our lives together. But to actually achieve that mastery, the framework introduces what it considers the supreme skill, the foundational muscle that has to be developed before anything else can stabilize.
Yes, the sati muscle.
Right. In the source language, the concept is sati, which translates roughly to mindfulness, or pure continuous awareness. This is elevated above all other human endeavors. Mindfulness is categorized as the most important function in life because it is the only mechanism capable of regulating and isolating thought.
But the methodology issues a really severe warning regarding this skill. It emphasizes that mindfulness is strictly a mechanical muscle. It is not an intellectual concept.
That's a huge distinction.
It is. It explicitly states that accumulating knowledge about mindfulness, reading the texts, discussing the philosophy, or even listening to us dissect it in this deep dive right now, will not build the muscle.
That is a harsh reality check for modern society. Because we're so conditioned to equate information consumption with personal transformation.
Mm.
Like, we believe that if we read enough neuroscience books or listen to enough optimization strategies, our brains will just inherently upgrade. But understanding the physics of a bicycle doesn't mean your nervous system actually knows how to balance on one.
The comparison to physical conditioning is exactly right. You can't read a book about push-ups to get a stronger chest. You have to subject the muscle fibers to actual physical resistance. The framework draws an absolute boundary between knowing about the mind and actively training the mind.
And what does that active training look like?
Training requires the rigorous, real-time application of awareness in the friction of your daily life. It is the active, repetitive practice of catching the mind the exact millisecond it wanders into a concoction and forcefully pulling it back to the present reality.
Okay, so we have to recognize that the only way forward is consistent mental resistance training. But to train effectively, you need an accurate map of the environment you are operating in, right? You need to know the potential states your machinery can enter.
Yes.
And our source material provides an extraordinarily granular map for this. It outlines exactly 5 operating modes that the human mind can function within.
This specific diagnostic section is perhaps the most practical tool in the entire text. It allows you to objectively measure where your consciousness is spending its processing power. These 5 modes map the complete spectrum of the human experience, from the deepest layers of suffering to total structural liberation.
Okay, let's dissect the mechanics of each one, because this is where the rubber meets the road. Mode 1 is categorized as the malicious or concocted mode. These are fundamentally unskillful thoughts. And the framework establishes this as the absolute default state for the untrained human being.
Right. Mode 1 is the operating system running purely on its ancient, unchecked momentum. It's resentment, greed, jealousy, self-pity, and the specific type of future-oriented anxiety we analyzed earlier.
So it's the state of being completely fused with mental concoctions. Like when you are sitting in traffic, utterly consumed by rage at the cars around you, your consciousness is entirely captured by Mode 1.
Exactly. You are generating suffering out of thin air in Mode 1.
Then we have the upward swing of the pendulum, Mode 2, the good or skillful mode. This encompasses compassionate thoughts, acts of genuine kindness, or simply executing your daily duties with a clear, unworried focus. It's the experience of, say, washing the dishes, and your mind is solely occupied with the sensation of the water and the soap.
It sounds peaceful, but the framework makes a vital observation about the instability of Mode 2. Individuals who possess a rudimentary level of mindfulness can force themselves into this mode temporarily. They can cultivate kindness, they can maintain focus for a brief window.
Go ahead.
But because they haven't systematically trained the sati muscle to a state of permanent tension, they are fighting gravity. Inevitably, a sufficiently strong external trigger will occur, their focus will shatter, and the pendulum will violently swing them back into the malicious concoctions of Mode 1.
That structural reality is deeply validating. It explains why the modern pursuit of constant positivity is so exhausting and ultimately prone to failure. Like, you meditate in the morning, you cultivate a mindset of gratitude, you enter Mode 2.
Feel great.
Right. But then by 2:00 p.m. an unexpected email arrives, the momentum of your ancient conditioning kicks in, and you instantly degrade back into Mode 1, completely consumed by frustration. The framework doesn't judge this, right?
Yeah.
It simply states it as a mechanical law of an untrained mind.
Exactly, it's just physics. To bypass that perpetual swinging between Mode 1 and Mode 2, you have to engage in deeper specialized training. Which brings us to Mode 3.
Mode 3.
The text describes Mode 3 as extinguishing thought. This is the state of operating with an entirely empty mind, achieving what classical traditions refer to as the levels of jhana or samadhi. This is the realm of intense, extreme concentration meditation.
Let's unpack the mechanics of samadhi, because it is very different from just casually paying attention to your breath. Mode 3 requires taking the entirety of your conscious awareness and anchoring it so aggressively to a single static point, like the physical sensation of breath entering the nostrils, that the processing power required to generate the endless chatter of Modes 1 and 2 is completely consumed.
Right.
The pop-up window simply cannot render because the RAM is maxed out. The mind goes utterly silent.
And the traditional analogy used to explain the mechanism of Mode 3 is placing a massive heavy stone over a patch of restless grass. While the stone of samadhi is firmly in place, the grass representing the chaotic, concocted thoughts cannot possibly grow. The physiological and psychological experience of this state is one of profound, crystalline peace.
It sounds amazing, But there is a critical limitation to mode 3, isn't there?
A huge limitation. The stone is temporary.
Right. The moment you stand up from the meditation cushion and re-enter the friction of daily life, you have to lift the heavy stone of concentration. And because the roots of the grass were never actually destroyed, the malicious and skillful concoctions inevitably begin to grow back.
Mode 3 suppresses the symptoms flawlessly, but it does not cure the underlying disease of attachment.
So how do we cure it?
To permanently cure the disease, you have to transition to the mechanism of Mode 4. The text labels this seeing thought, which directly correlates to the practice of vipassana, or insight meditation. The strategy here shifts entirely. You are no longer using the heavy stone of concentration to crush the thoughts into silence. Instead, you are systematically observing the raw data of reality. The microscopic movements of the body, the rising and falling of physical sensations, and most importantly, the exact moment a thought arises and passes away.
The distinction between mode 3 and mode 4 is fascinating.
Yeah.
In mode 4, you actually want the thoughts to happen so you can study their structural integrity. You are actively watching the machinery operate.
Yes.
So when a thought of intense anger arises, you don't fight it and you don't suppress it. You watch it peak in intensity. You watch it inevitably decay and shade into nothingness. You observe, repeatedly, that the anger is transient. It is just a temporary transfer of cognitive energy. And because it is impermanent, it cannot possibly be the core you.
You're creating a permanent partition between the observer and the phenomena. If you maintain that partition long enough and you observe thousands upon thousands of these cognitive cycles arising and decaying, the architecture states that you will inevitably trigger the final transition.
Which is mode 5.
Yes, you enter mode 5, ultimate realization. This is the permanent structural realization that thoughts and even the fundamental mind itself are not self.
Let's synthesize these tools just to make sure we have the complete map. Modes 1 and 2 are the inescapable, exhausting pendulum for the untrained human. Mode 3 utilizes the tool of samadhi to achieve temporary relief by suppressing the system.
Right.
But modes 4 and 5 utilize the tool of vipassana to fundamentally rewrite how consciousness interacts with reality. Mode 5 isn't just a mood improvement, it is a total paradigm shift. It's the experiential realization that there is no central ghost driving the machine. There's only the machine reacting to inputs.
Which forces us to address the ultimate question of this entire deep dive. What functionally happens to a human being when they successfully stabilize in those highest modes? If you actually commit to the rigorous mental push-ups, what is the exact end game of this mental training?
And the methodology outlines the final results with clinical precision. It states that by continuously operating in mode 4, by ruthlessly observing the transient mechanics of your own thoughts, a literal separation occurs within your cognitive structure.
Yes, the active thoughts and the underlying mind that observes them permanently detach. The pop-up windows lose their ability to interact with the core operating system.
And the mechanical result of that detachment is profound. The violent fluctuations of the pendulum, those exhausting dramatic swings between intense joy and crushing suffering, they begin to neutralize completely on their own. You no longer have to exert massive willpower to force control over your mind. The swings simply lose their kinetic energy because the attachment that previously fueled them has been severed.
The text describes the individual who achieves this as becoming deeply calm and profoundly wise. But the most crucial metric of success is that they are no longer a slave to their own desires.
And it is important to clarify that reaching this state doesn't mean you become like a lifeless robot.
No, not at all.
You still experience the sensory input of life. You still feel physical sensations. But your internal state is no longer held hostage by a desperate, frantic need for external reality to conform to your specific preferences.
And that stability prepares you for the ultimate confrontation, what we might categorize as the final boss of human consciousness.
I love that phrase, the final boss.
It really is, because the framework dictates that as you continue to observe the detached machinery of the mind, you eventually perceive a terrifying yet liberating truth. Even the mind itself, the core consciousness that is doing the observing, is not a solid, permanent entity. It is a rapid, continuous, flickering process of arising and passing away.
But if we follow that logic to its absolute conclusion, it shatters our entire concept of identity. I mean, if even the foundational mind isn't a permanent, unchanging thing, then what is actually left of us?
What is left is a state of absolute structural liberation. The source explains that once this flickering, impermanent nature of the mind is experientially realized, not just understood intellectually, but witnessed firsthand, The deepest, most ancient root of human suffering is utterly annihilated.
And that root is,
That root is the subconscious reflexive process that constantly generates the claim of ownership. This is mine. This thought is mine. This physical pain is mine. This success is mine.
we claim ownership over the hallucinations. Like
Yeah.
we look at the pop-up window of anxiety and we say, this is my anxiety. We take a transient piece of data and we fuse it to our core identity.
Precisely. But when you experientially witness that the mind itself isn't a permanent you, the illusion of ownership fundamentally breaks. You cannot claim ownership over a process that is constantly dissolving. And when the illusion of ownership breaks, the methodology states that attachment is destroyed. And without the structural glue of attachment, psychological suffering simply lacks the mechanics to exist.
The implications of this are staggering. Because this framework isn't just offering a productivity hack so you can experience less stress in your corporate job. It is offering a complete fundamental system update for human existence.
It really is.
It concludes by stating that achieving this destruction of attachment, waking up from the involuntary hallucination of the self, is the literal purpose of being born human. It asserts that accomplishing this is fulfilling your human duty flawlessly.
It's an uncompromising reframe of what constitutes a successful human life. It argues that the ultimate metric of success isn't defined by outward achievements, the accumulation of wealth, the pursuit of social status, the building of a legacy. The true mechanical purpose of our existence is achieving the state of total inner liberation from our own cognitive machinery.
But, and we have to emphasize this, the framework refuses to coddle the reader. It delivers one final reminder that this liberation is inaccessible to those who merely intellectualize it. It requires rigorous, sincere, daily practice. It yields real things, but only for real people who are willing to do the excruciating work of observing their mind, second by second, without blinking.
If we zoom out and look at how this applies to the friction of daily life, it rewrites the rules of engagement for hardship. If you successfully break the illusion of ownership, psychological suffering logically has no surface area to land on.
Right.
If a wave of intense anxiety arises, but the subconscious no longer categorizes it as my anxiety, it ceases to be a threat. It just becomes an impersonal phenomenon occurring in the environment. You don't have to fix it. You don't have to analyze its origin. You simply let the simulation run its course until it inevitably runs out of energy and stops.
To synthesize the immense ground we have covered in this deep dive, we began by confronting the uncomfortable reality that we are entirely distinct from our thoughts. We learned that the vast majority of our daily cognitive load is actually just a restless hallucination mental concoctions that drag us into the non-existent realms of the past and the future.
We dissected the mechanical failure of forced positive thinking, understanding that we cannot simply overpower lifetimes of evolutionary momentum. Instead, we explored the ultimate systemic hack, learning to securely isolate and see the thought rather than fusing with it and trying to control it.
We recognize that this architectural truth is the ultimate equalizer. It renders raw intelligence and wealth irrelevant, prioritizing only the relentless development of the sati muscle, the supreme skill of mindfulness. We map the 5 operational modes of consciousness, transitioning from the malicious default state through the temporary suppression of samadhi and arriving at the permanent structural insight of vipassana.
And we arrived at the framework's profound, uncompromising conclusion that systematically observing the mind until the illusion of ownership is destroyed is not a wellness trend. It is the flawlessly executed purpose of human life, culminating in the highly mechanical, deeply achievable reality of 0% suffering.
Which brings us all the way back to the scenario we started with. That suffocating feeling of lying in bed, commanding your brain to shut down while it relentlessly generates 1,000 different simulated anxieties. The next time you find yourself trapped in that sequence, instead of fighting the machinery and instead of getting frustrated that you cannot delete the pop-up windows, step back into the underlying operating system. Just watch the code run.
And the next time you catch your consciousness spiraling into a fabricated worry about tomorrow or a deep regret about yesterday, pause the simulation. Watch the data of that thought arise and ask yourself a structural question. If I am the one observing this worry, then who or what am I?